We need on-site renewable energy, high efficiency, and all-electric homes everywhere in order to have a safe, just transition.
There are going to be incredible opportunities for workers in this new energy economy.
That environmental justice is also about communities being able to take charge of their own infrastructure.
In a time when corporate spending is protected as free speech, each of us must wonder how our voices will be heard. Utility companies have deep pockets, and their lobbyists are a fixture at state capitol buildings. Big businesses have big energy budgets, and their associations are adept at making their issues a priority. And both of these industry sectors work together to create advocacy groups to advance their common interests. So what about residential energy customers? What about small businesses? Our resources pale in comparison. How are our voices heard, and how are our concerns addressed, especially when they are at odds with the interests of utility companies and big corporations? Luckily, for most residential and small business ratepayers in the Midwest, we are represented by a state citizens utility board, known as CUB. These nonprofit groups work tirelessly to make sure that our needs are represented at Public Utility Commission and legislative hearings. For decades, they have taken a hard-nosed approach at keeping electricity costs low while ensuring that expenses aren't shifted to electric bills of homes and small businesses. This takes the form of fighting proposals from utilities to increase the fixed charges on our utility bills, analyzing the costs and justification of new infrastructure projects proposed by the utility companies and making sure they are needed and reasonable, and ensuring that homes and businesses have access to cost-saving measures like energy efficiency and solar energy. The nation's first Citizens Utility Board was created 40 years ago in Madison, Wisconsin. Through their work, CUB has helped Wisconsinites save billions on their energy bills. In the Midwest, residents of Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio also benefit from CUB's representation. In the context of the energy transition, CUB's advocacy role is critically important if we want an energy system that best serves people. We discuss the energy transition and the benefits of increased citizen involvement with Tom Content, longtime journalist and executive director of the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin.
The MREA's 32nd Annual Energy Fair is upon us. Join us at the fairgrounds in Custer, Wisconsin, June 23rd through the 25th to take a step towards clean energy and sustainable living for all. From workshops and exhibitors to special events and live music, there's something for everyone. Make your plans and visit theenergyfair.org to learn more. We can't wait to see you at the fair.
We are joined today by Tom Content. He's the executive director of the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin. He joined CUB in 2017. After working for more than 30 years as a journalist, he became interested in energy and what it costs households while sitting in the back seat waiting for what seemed like forever during the gas lines of the 1970s. Graduated from Boston University's College of Communication, worked in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania before moving to Wisconsin, where he reported on utilities and worked as a business editor at the Green Bay Press Gazette in the 90s, then moved to Milwaukee and covered energy, utilities, and sustainable business for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Tom has, in his reporting on energy and climate change, won the National Press Club Stokes Award for energy writing in 2007. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me. This is exciting. It's a good opportunity to kind of connect with folks.
Good. Well, we're excited to talk with you. You have a lot of experience, and maybe we'll start with that little snippet in your bio about waiting in gas lines and the 1970s energy crisis that resulted from our intervention in the Yom Kippur War and Iran's oil embargo. And I guess I'm wondering, all of your reporting in today, how that event kind of influenced the way we think about energy and think about policy today.
What we're seeing today is, in the last year or so, are some of the biggest energy price increases that we've seen in some time, and public involvement that we've seen in the rate cases, the public involvement, the media interest in inflation in general, but in particular with energy inflation, has been striking to see. Now that I'm no longer a reporter, just to see what's going on from the kind of the advocate side of things. For me as a kid, it was frustrating to be on those gas lines, and I ended up, as one of my high school research projects, pretty small potato stuff, but I sent away for information on, alternative fuel vehicles of the future, and these, high-speed electric trains and all these things, and lo and behold, here we are. We're seeing, electrifying of the vehicles. We're seeing high-speed trains in some parts of the country, and especially around the world. Seeing the electric industry kind of coalescing over this move toward electrification, which is fascinating to watch.
I think that's a really good analogy, this kind of public focusing that happened in the 70s and where we are today. One thing that I keep thinking about, after this energy crisis in the 70s was kind of the political responses and how they're relatively similar today, which was like Jimmy Carter and, and broadly speaking, like energy efficiency, wear a sweater, learn to use less energy. And like the Reagan administration and James Watt, like, oh, the Carter energy policy means you'll be cold, alone, and in the dark. And it's all about production. And you've followed, energy politics and policy in many states and a lot in Wisconsin. How has that evolved over the years? Like, what stories do you think that you covered still have a lot of significance today?
The stories that have significance or that I think had a lasting impact were the stories that showed that the state was using focus on energy dollars, tapping that fund for shared revenue to provide aid to cities and towns. So you imagine ratepayer dollars that are supposed to go toward this purpose of promoting energy efficiency and actually reducing energy use statewide so that we can push off the need for new power plants. And instead of investing in that, we were helping buy a fire truck in, was it Palmyra? I don't know exactly where it was, but you can imagine the whole point of investing in energy efficiency is so you can see the return on that, right? We talked about the funding diversions in our articles, and there was a lot of public concern about that back then, 15 years ago or so. And that led to changes to the Focus on Energy program where it's no longer something that's part of the state budget process every 2 years. And so it insulated that program. In some ways, the program is kind of locked in at that 1.2% of sales now, but it wasn't maximizing its potential back in the day. And then the other thing I just bring up is our climate and energy series that you mentioned at the beginning, which as part of that, it was an interesting analysis of looking at, how much were those new coal plants going to be adding to the state's carbon footprint, because we had just gotten approval to build the new coal plant in Oak Creek, the new coal plant in Wausau, which now, lo and behold, however many years later, 15 years later or so, now they're talking about converting the big coal plant in Oak Creek to burn natural gas at some point, and I'm not sure what the plan is for Wausau. The pivotal decisions from a consumer point of view of that coal plant decision, which I covered a lot of stories about, Sam Johnson of SC Johnson marching in the streets of Racine to protest that coal plant, and it was approved. And from a cost point of view, it was approved with a 12.7% guaranteed profit, which is something that I thought was worth reporting on back in the day, and that's something that is still kind of an albatross or something that noose around the neck for Energy's customers as far as the affordability challenge that we work on with utility customers and utility issues today at CUB.
There's a real lesson there, right? And you're experiencing it, which is we will pay the price for many decades to come for our energy decisions today. And we're paying the price for our past energy decisions. One of them being, like you said, in Wisconsin, Public Service Commission at the time, not only did they approve these, long-lasting, expensive capital projects, but they approved them at very high rates of return, which tends to attract more investment. And so, how does that, this, because I look at the state of Iowa, where they allow their utilities much less rate of return, 7.5%. We're still, where are we at today? 10%. And historically, when we built all the assets we're trying to close today, or that the utilities are proposing to close, we were almost double that. How did that come about, and how has that impacted the energy market in Wisconsin today? Wisconsin
has had this reputation, no matter who's appointing the commissioners of the PSC, Wisconsin's had a reputation as being investor friendly for utilities. In other words, favorable to the utilities and their desire to raise capital and their desire to benefit their shareholders. unfortunately, that puts the customers at a disadvantage. So as a result, the profit rates, those returns on equity that you talk about, are higher than the national average in Wisconsin. And so we're overpaying by hundreds of millions of dollars a year. In the most recent case, Cubs advocacy could have saved customers of We Energies and Wisconsin Public Service over $100 million if the PSC had sided with our view of what was a healthy and sufficient profit rate for those utilities. They ended up deciding to bring the profit rate down slightly from 10% down to 9.8, and that saved about $25 million bucks. But the savings could have been that much more. And when we're seeing energy costs, affecting homeowners and renters across Milwaukee and across the region this year with both high heating costs and the electric rate hike, there's a lot of animus about that. And there's a lot of concern about how are people going to be able to afford their bills. And so bringing those profit rates down at a level that they'll still be able to go to raise capital, they'll still be able to build their project, but it just doesn't have to be excessive. And that's we've got a track record, unfortunately, in Wisconsin, of really excessive profits.
Well, I think this really leads into your work currently. I just want to say your story of learning moment in the gas lines. Mm-hmm. And your continued interest and your following the energy markets and reporting on them professionally has brought you now to this position with the Citizens Utility Board, which I think is just really, maybe the term would be fitting, and how well suited you are for this role. So why don't you talk to us about what is a Citizens Utility Board and why is it important?
And it just circles right back to the 70s and the vision of, and the price hikes that people were seeing for energy, the push to build nuclear plants left, right, and everywhere back in the 70s. And so Ralph Nader actually had the vision, and it was almost 50 years ago. It was 1974. He had this vision that there should be a consumer advocate for the little guy in every state of the country. And none other than Wisconsin was the first state to take him up on that suggestion. And so some legislators in Madison worked with some of Nader's raiders, if you will, Nader's folks, to draft the Cub bill. And it took a couple sessions, but we now have a Citizens Utility Board. And so we're a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan advocate for the residential and small business and farm customers of Wisconsin utilities. And so we're there right at the point where the decisions are made. Utilities just can't do things on their own. It's a monopoly system, which means it's a regulated monopoly. The state government is there to set the prices as a proxy for competition and as a way to and set the profit rates as well. Nader wanted to make sure that there was balance because he knew the utilities had a lot of influence in the state capitals and big business had a lot of influence in state capitals. And so that's the vision of CUB, is to make sure that those who don't have a voice can participate and have a voice representing them in these decisions. We like to call it an energy democracy. In a democracy, everybody should be voting. More people should be voting every election, right? In energy democracy, more people should be participating through public hearings, through getting their own voice heard, through public comments, getting involved in organizations like MREA or Renew if they're interested in renewables, CUB if they're just interested in fairness and affordability. There are opportunities for people to get involved.
What a compelling vision at the time, and it's only gotten more important, as our politics have turned more and more pay to play, and we see that with, if you follow politics, you're surely familiar with dark money groups and just the tremendous amount of money that flows into the political system. Your point that as a residential ratepayer, we don't have lobbyists crawling around the Capitol, but the utilities sure do. And right. Industry sure does. And that's the role that you play, is making sure that our voice is heard. How is CUB funded when they pass this legislation? My understanding that it's actually not tax dollars, it's ratepayer dollars. Can you talk a little bit about how you're supported?
It wasn't any tax money or ratepayer dollars. It was just fundraising. But that was back in the 80s. That model didn't work because we had inserts that went into utility bills. But the utilities in another state, the utilities took that to court, and the Supreme Court under Judge Rehnquist decided that the CUB inserts were violating the free speech rights of the utilities by having the messaging going out for the CUBs. So that's why we've had to shift to different models. And most recently, we did work through the legislative process so that now about if a typical electric bill is 95 or $100 a month, a penny or so goes to Cub. And that's just from the residential and small business customers and small industrial customers of Wisconsin. And so with that, we've been able to build up a small but forceful regulatory team where we now have a regulatory team of 4 people and a total staff of 6. So that I don't know that it's leveled the playing field. The utilities still outspend us in their regulatory expense. I won't even get into the lobbying aspect. I'm one lobbyist. The utilities, when we went in, the utilities supported the legislation for the Cub funding, which we appreciated. But when we were at the hearings, there were far more utility lobbyists in the room than there were Cub employees. The utilities at the PSC generally outspend Cub 3 to 4 to 1 because they will come into a case like a rate case, or if they want to build a project, they will come in and bring in well-paid lawyers as well as 8 or 9 expert witnesses. And we usually have, 2 or 3 expert witnesses. So we have to pick our spots. Even with this funding level, we have to pick our fights and pick our spots on how we want to push things forward.
You started talking a little bit about some of the activities you're involved in. Tell us, what are you working on today? Why should people care?
The big issues have been the rate cases. That's what we primarily focus on. But we're also involved in all the construction cases. We want to see that in the case of a natural gas plant or a solar plant, what are the assumptions that the utilities put into that? Is it needed? Is it cost effective? Is it the right choice for the future? Are kind of the bottom lines. And that's what the PSC has to decide. But then we have a team that comes in and looks at the data that the utility provide, and they'll come out with these projections like, this is going to save umpteen $1 million over 30 years is about this particular project. Let's take an example, the natural gas plant that was proposed for the Wausau area by Wisconsin Public Service and We Energies. New natural gas plant, it's these RICE units. And we looked at it and we thought, my expert, our economics strategist, looked at it and he said, the assumptions for natural gas prices over time are about like from here to here. And with the war in Ukraine, we were already seeing gas prices go up. And what if the gas prices stayed high? Would this be economic in the long term? We asked for them to run the numbers based on a wider range of natural gas prices, just in this one example, and we found out that in more than half of the scenarios, this plant wouldn't be in the money. So it would be spending more than we'd be getting back in savings on our energy bills from building it. So those are the kind of things where we get into we're data driven and we get into the nitty gritty of utility finance and utility regulation. This year we're looking at a bunch of rate cases again. Last year was We Energies and Wisconsin Public Service. They're going to be coming back for a small case this year, which could increase bills. And then the other 3 major utilities are also going to be expected to come in for rate cases. Wisconsin Power and Light, Alliant, Xcel, and Madison Gas and Electric. Nobody's going to be bored this year.
The role of Cub is so critical. And, in the context that you're explaining, utilities have all the incentives to build expensive projects. They make money by making capital investments and increasing their rate of return. And in some ways, if their investments overperform expectations, then keeping that profit. And, which is something that I know you've been involved in, if the investment doesn't pan out and they want to close it, then making sure they get paid for the full life of the system plus interest. And, Cub may be, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, but you may be the organization that really has that interest in saving ratepayer money front and center at all times. And it has been the case, if I'm not wrong, that you weren't always in favor of solar energy because it might not have been the best investment. And now more and more Cubs across the country are aligned with this idea of distributed generation plus energy efficiency as a cost-saving measure. And so I guess I wonder, Tom, thinking about your role here and some of the work that you do, has your work evolved over time and have the issues that you've been focusing on changed?
It has evolved. We know that there's this big energy transition happening. We welcome the fact that solar prices have declined to the point where it's one of the most, if you look at the national studies, it's the most cost-effective, one of the most cost-effective forms of generation, if not wind and solar together, are both cost-effective compared if you were to have a greenfield decision on should I build coal, nuclear, natural gas, wind, solar? Renewables are winning on the economic side. And so what we're advocating for a cost-effective clean energy transition. And so that means shutting down, saving customers when those coal plants are shut down, so they're not profiting on those coal plants long after they're gone. But really what's evolved in more recent years is our focus on affordability, because prices have gotten so high, but we weren't, as a state, the utilities, the PSC, and even CUB haven't been as focused on those struggling the most to make ends meet. And I think that's been a deficiency. And I think the attention on equity and affordability that's now happening across the utility industry, with a focus on where are the pockets of energy poverty happening, where is the household energy burden the highest. That's been a more intense focus since I joined CUB, and also in even more recent years, the last couple of years.
I noticed that during COVID, that CUB was front and center in advocating for utility bill shutoff moratoriums, and then also in the negotiation to what to do with all of the unpaid utility bills, which surely is an equity issue. Do you want to talk about that and kind of, as a second part, what else can the commission be doing to be more proactive on energy poverty?
I think the first thing was that, during COVID, it was a public health emergency. And so if you had shutoffs in the summer, what normally would happen in the city of Milwaukee is people would go to cooling centers and congregate in cooling centers to cool off during the summer months. You can't go to cooling centers during COVID at a time when you're pre-vaccine and you're not supposed to be congregating in big groups. Same issue with the winter. So as a result, they extended that winter moratorium and basically made it all year long and extended it into the next year. Once that ended, there were unpaid bills that had to be dealt with. And the PSC worked, and the state actually worked collaboratively with the utilities to attack some of those and really go after and reduce some of those overdue balances using money that Congress had appropriated through some of the COVID relief bills. That's the first thing. But then CUB worked with some of the utilities and supported forgiveness programs. So Alliant has an arrearage management program, and We Energies and WPS call it LIFT, Low Income Forgiveness Tool. So it's basically trying to get low-income folks who have been unable to pay their bills back on a regular cycle of paying, even if it's just a portion of their bills. And if they stay on that program after a year, all their back bills are forgiven. And so that's one tool that we've been trying to work on to help people. And then in the most recent rate cases, we negotiated for the utilities to actually raise rates on everybody else for some of those COVID-related costs. There were over $34 million in COVID-related costs, whether it was late fees that they didn't collect because the PSC didn't allow them to collect, but they were like, oh, this is money that they still wanted to get after the fact. CUB negotiated with, in the rate settlement last year, that the utilities agreed to write that off. When it came time for the decision on the case to happen, PSC didn't actually accept our settlement, but they ended up liking that proposal and accepted that proposal that we negotiated on behalf of the customers. And going forward, I think there's two areas. There's equity of process, and then there's just making things better for folks who are struggling to make ends meet. And the PSC's been working on that, the equity of the process. They have encouraged more public participation in those performance-based regulation workshops that are going on in Madison. So you've had folks, you saw Walnut Way Conservation Corp intervene in a rate case. It was the first time we've actually had a BIPOC-led advocacy group for a struggling neighborhood intervene in a rate case. And it didn't go perfectly for them, but there were bumps along the road. But they got to participate. They got in public involvement and more people interested in these issues and involved in these issues. And I think the more you can get people focused on these issues, the more awareness there is, I think, better results for everybody. And so I think the PSC needs to keep moving down that path, and I think that's something that Chair Vok has focused on. And then for people, the last thing I'll just mention is another thing that is coming soon at the PSC is a proposal for a low-income discount rate. So other states, Colorado, Minnesota, other states beyond that, California, some near, some far, have percent of income programs where if your income is below a certain level, instead of the utility bill just being based on how much energy you use, your income should factor into that, and your ability to pay should factor into how much you pay. And so those cases are coming up this year at the PSC, and we're hopeful that we're going to work with Walnut Way, We Energies, WPS, and other stakeholders to advance those, because those are sorely needed.
That directly tackles this concept of energy poverty, which is households that pay a high portion of their expenses and utility expenses because those expenses are fixed. But isn't it also true that most commissions, including Wisconsin, don't even track energy poverty data, and that's kind of almost a precursor to understanding this issue? Is that correct?
It's correct that it's not being tracked it hasn't been tracked in a comprehensive way around the country. CUB has been urging in public comments and in various cases over the years that we should be tracking this, and the PSC took us up on that. So they've actually, starting in 2021, are requiring all the big utilities to file energy burden analyses. Some of them are more granular than others. We want them all to be based on, so that you can actually zero in on a census tract by census tract basis, so you can see really clearly where the pockets of poverty are happening. I live, a couple miles from the 53206 zip code in Milwaukee, which is obviously one of the poorest, if not the poorest zip code in the state. We know where poverty is happening in urban areas, but in some cases around the state, there are pockets from the studies that have been done, there are pockets of high household energy burden where people are really struggling in rural parts of Wisconsin. And getting a better feel for that is important, because once you have that information, you can target programs to those communities. Way back 15 or so years ago, almost maybe I'm dating myself, but over 15 or so years ago, there was a targeted energy efficiency program just for communities, 2 communities in the state. It was a WPS program that CUB had worked with and Wisconsin Energy Conservation Corp at the time. And they targeted Alloway and Brilliant, and there were substantial incentives, enhanced incentives for people to really make their homes more efficient. And people took advantage of it. The program stopped, but it didn't stop because it wasn't working. It stopped because priorities were shifting away from energy efficiency and back toward, the utility, just supplying the supply side of the utility and sector. We need to keep the focus on the demand side whenever we can. And I think right now, what's fortunate is that so many things are aligning in a good direction, because the Focus on Energy program is developing some of these community pilots that would actually be targeted at low and moderate income folks in certain areas. That's a new thing. The Inflation Reduction Act is coming, and as well as the Infrastructure Act, which target funding for Justice 40 communities of concern and low income, and the IRA has enhanced heat pump and other incentives for low income. It's not available yet, but it's coming. And so there are a lot of things that are kind of coalescing as this whole industry is looking at equity and affordability.
Obviously, very supportive of all of that work, and very happy that you all are involved. And you brought up, some recent federal legislation that not only provides some incentives for efficiency and renewables adoption by low to moderate income households and by communities of concern, but also kind of really, we're going to spend more money on energy infrastructure in the next 10 years than we did in the previous 30, and that's a whole new framework here. And so I guess the context here, what I want to get your perspective on is that, we don't have some sort of central planning function when it comes to energy markets. We are a 50-state experiment. There's multiple layers of bureaucracy, a ship with many captains. And I guess from your seat, thinking about ratepayers, and thinking about daily about the process by which we make decisions, how do you think that this recent federal legislation will affect us and the way that we make decisions? What do we need to do? How do we need to change to take the fullest advantage of this opportunity?
There's just so much in there. It's when I was reporting on utilities, and I was reporting on the clean energy sector, and they were kind of separate tracks. And there were certain things where you could sense that it was going to start to converge, and that's why I covered the business of sustainability. And so companies like Johnson Controls, and they were doing car batteries for electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles back then, and you could see these things starting to converge. And then when I joined Cub, the conversion happened really fast, and the drop of the price of solar was just so incredible over the last 5-10 years that utilities started seeing the green of building solar, because it's financially advantageous to them. And I was going to start there with the IRA, because the incentives for utility scale solar are even enhanced by this, plus an utility scale battery storage, because you get the 30% tax credit, and then you can layer on an extra 10% if it's on the site of a former coal plant, for example, or if it's an extra 10% if it's the solar panels are made in the U.S., an extra 10% if somehow it's a project that is focused on low-income folks. I mean, imagine getting up to a 60 or 70% tax credit on something that's already cost-effective, right? So that's why it is game-changing in terms of what we're expecting to see come forward. And then the fact that there's a 30% tax credit just for storage. Battery technologies are advancing, and so you're seeing utilities already talking about different chemistries than lithium ion for use as stationary storage, because certain battery chemistries, lithium ion is good for short duration storage, but other chemistries which maybe aren't as cost effective today are going to be better use for longer duration storage when the sun's obviously the sun doesn't shine all night, right? So to give you that extra backup from energy storage. And then on the consumer side, and the residential and business side, there's just so much in here. Electrifying appliances, whole home energy efficiency, as well as the heat pumps, which is what's gotten a lot of attention, is so many incentives for heat pumps. It's what's frustrating is that it passed already months ago, and we still don't have clarity on exactly what form it's going to take, how the programs are going to be rolled out. And that's, again, the 50 different captains of their respective ships they all have to decide that, and so does Wisconsin's captain. I almost think that now, given the war, I shouldn't use the word czar, but when in the Obama administration they had a Great Lakes czar and a drug czar, and I almost think you need somebody who's a point person across state agencies to really be in charge and really target how this can be done most effectively, because this is a huge, it's the biggest federal spending investment ever on climate change and energy, and you don't want that money to be wasted. You want it to be spent well, and especially with the focus of those bills, of that legislation, on helping low-income folks through the Justice 40 initiative. I think there needs to be a targeted approach there, where sometimes the weatherization side and the focus on energy side and the utility side of the low income, there's so many pieces to affordable housing. Focus on energy or energy contractors may be ready to invest in and insulate a house, but if the house has a huge hole in it, that needs to be dealt with first. So there's a lot of challenges when it comes to the cycle of poverty, and one of them is just making sure that all these things can sync together well.
Really good blanket recommendation, right? It's more coordination.
Exactly.
We need to coordinate our efforts. I think, the way I've been thinking about it is that, that during COVID, the Treasury and the Fed, they committed a $10 trillion backstop to Wall Street. And then the federal government, so that the rest of us could have some support too, they passed legislation that's, predominantly unfunded. It's based on, debt. And so part of me is really thinks that we all need to focus on spending this money as wisely as possible. These investments have to create real long-term community supporting and family supporting wealth in all of our communities, and that takes coordination. So I liked your recommendation for kind of a statewide multi-department approach to really make sure we're leveraging these funds. I guess maybe coming to the commission, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the commission in Wisconsin in particular is really positioned to only be a reactive commission, really just responding to rate cases. They can't really, there's no central planning function per se that has any teeth to it. I guess what is your perspective there? How is the commission, are they well suited and in the process that we have to deal with this rapidly changing market? And if not, what more can we be doing?
They're trying to pick their spots, and one of the areas where we really appreciate their hard work that they have put in is on the issue of performance-based regulation. And I'll get to the planning in a sec. So, but on the issue of performance-based regulation, you talked about this earlier, but the capital bias of the incentives, right? So it's not as if they're with performance-based regulation. It's not Pabst Blue Ribbon. It's a different PBR. It's where you can really focus the incentives on what matters. Because right now there are plenty of incentives built into the utility model. And the incentive favors the supply side, it favors expanding rate base. And what does that mean? That means the potential of overbuilding and saddling customers with too much cost to support returns that are too high. And so that's the model that's the George Jetson train that we keep running on and running, and we need to step off of that. And PBR gives us a chance to step off, because right now, the utilities and their compensation policies, they get more incentive pay if they get a higher profit. They should have their incentive packages structured so that if rates are more affordable, maybe they get an adder on their executive or incentive pay. By the same token, on their profits, there should be, through PBR, you could set up metrics so that if rates are affordable, you get a little adder to your profit. If rates aren't affordable, you might get a penalty to your profit. Put the incentives where issues that people care about: energy efficiency, customer service, reliability. We all want the lights to come on, right? And affordability. Make sure that the incentives are built in so that when you're an independent regulator reviewing a proposal to raise rates, you can say, well, let's evaluate how are they doing on X, Y, and Z, and really have a more holistic analysis of the pluses and minuses from the customer point of view. So but they are moving down a path through the workshops they've had on performance-based regulation, which grew out of the Road to Net Zero docket at the commission. So that's been a positive. But the planning challenge is right there in front of us, and that's been an issue that CUB has been concerned about for a long time, long before I joined CUB. And we're not saying go back to the 70s or the 80s and the processes that were in place back then, because and that doesn't make sense, because that was a statewide planning process that basically you had to pick, as a state agency, you were picking winners and losers among the different utilities. If we had a Minnesota and other states, Minnesota's close, so I use that as an example, but other states have this too, an integrated resource planning process that it's just targeted for each utility. So each utility has to file its own 5-year plan with the commission, and that gets analyzed. That's something that was sorely lacking. And energy rates, utility rates for residential customers used to be among the least in the Midwest, the lowest in the Midwest, and now we're second highest. And that goes straight back to overinvestment in costly projects that are saddling customers on their bills, whether that's the new Oak Creek coal plant, whether that's the power purchase agreement that escalates by leaps and bounds every single year for the Point Beach nuclear plant. There are a lot of unfortunate decisions that we're kind of saddled with that we're trying to make up for every day. Overarching that is this planning challenge, and we've heard some of the commissioners themselves raising that concern in some of the discussions they've had about particular projects.
If we had an integrated resource planning process and say Alliant Energy or WPS had a 5-year plan, and then the Federal Inflation Reduction Act passed, the commission could say, hey, update your plan with this new market structure in mind. But instead, we don't even have a plan to start with. So it's hard to understand really the mid to long term impacts of what, and we can guess, right? And so planning is so central. Tom, I'm gonna give you a magic wand. Okay.
Oh God! Oh, I love those. I would love to have.
I'm gonna give you a magic wand. I know you wish you had one as a nonprofit, small but effective ratepayer advocate. I'm sure you could effectively use a number of magic wands, but you only get this one. It can only be used once. You can change something about the energy system in Wisconsin that you think would provide the most benefit. What would you do?
I'm going to cheat and I'm going to say one thing about the system, which is I think it's that planning aspect. I actually do think it's the planning aspect that needs to change and needs reform. There's no incentive to cut costs right now. There's no incentive. There's no requirement for competitive procurement when the utilities go out and build a solar farm or a natural gas plant. So I think that's job one. But what I really would want to wave a magic wand across Wisconsin would be to have much, much, much greater participation in our energy democracy. Turning the lights on and off is, when so many people just don't even think about this stuff from day to day until the lights don't turn on when you flip the switch, right? Or you get your bill and it's oh my gosh, how much did it go up? We have an occasion now that we are seeing energy price inflation, where more people are becoming aware, but how many more? Not enough, right? I think it's great that 1,700 people took part in the public hearing process, either at showing up for a hearing or filing a comment or attending the Zoom hearing for the two rate cases that just happened last fall. We need more of that. We need people from across the state to get involved, and because it's your energy future. It's all of our energy future. And if we don't get involved, it'll be built for us and it'll focus on the supply side like we've been talking about almost way too exclusively. We need the public to demand energy efficiency. Energy efficiency saves people money, puts off the need for any new power plant, and it's also the studies have shown it's the least cost way to tackle climate change. So if you're concerned about carbon, energy efficiency. If you're concerned about prices, energy efficiency. If you're concerned about utilities overbuilding, energy efficiency. It all syncs up. I wish that I could encourage, thousands more people, tens of thousands more people to get involved in this stuff, because it's big stuff. It's life sustaining services they're monopolies for a reason. They just have to be regulated well. And the way they're regulated well is if they're responding to the public that cares about a consumer-centric future that they want to see built.
Tom, I really appreciate that sentiment. How about we start on this path with your magic wand? How can people support your work and those of other citizens utility boards?
They can support us. Come to cubwi.org is our website. You can sign up for our email newsletter. You can check out our blog. You can check out our Cub Tracks podcast, which is on various podcast platforms. Thank you for being on our podcast last summer. And then we have donate buttons or how to give and support us financially. We're looking to increase our membership, so to expand the number of residential members we have across the state, as well as expand the number of small business members we have across the state. And so there are ways to do that right from our website. And if people want to find out more, the other thing they can do is just reach out, because we were ready to come out and talk to folks, talk to community groups, neighborhood groups, Rotary clubs, you name it. If you want, we give talks on how to save on your energy bills. We give talks on energy policy and this need for more planning and the need for the steps that can be taken toward a more people-focused power future. But just reach out, because we can build this over time if people join us.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your experience and for doing all that you do. Is there anything else you'd like to leave us with?
Thanks for the opportunity. We're the oldest Cub, but now it's just a little trivia is that there are 6 or 8 Cubs around the country now. And actually, it's not like the rest of the states go unrepresented. A lot of attorneys general and there are state government agencies that actually are designated consumer advocates around the country. And what I'm fortunate at Cub Wisconsin is that now we're able to partner with those folks through our national association. So now we're part of this national group of consumer advocates that are all kind of working together. So on the issue of equity and affordability, we just passed a big resolution last fall on the issue that you just brought up earlier, Nick, which is that states need to start collecting more granular data on an apples-to-apples basis to tackle this energy burden problem. And what's good from a customer point of view is that there are people that are looking at these issues, and that we're trying to learn best practices and best ideas from around the country through these national affiliations and bring them back to Wisconsin. But so that's an exciting thing that's happened that I'm excited about as part of leading Cub is increasing our alliances around the country so that we can have kind of the movement that Ralph Nader dreamed about really take hold.
Well, good. I'm excited to experience it. Thank you so much for all you do, Tom, and thanks for sharing your time with us.
All right, thanks, Nick. We appreciate it.
The Rise Up Podcast, Season 4, Episode 11, Voice of the People. Special thanks to our guest, Tom Content, hosted by Nick Hyla and produced by Kyle Galloway, made possible with support from the Sally Mead Hands Foundation.